the rugged Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, back in March 1954, while most boys his age were already hauling coal or chopping wood to prove their worth, 13-year-old Jasper Whitaker was scrambling up a steep, rocky path toward a forgotten hollow so wild and remote that even the hungriest miners had given it a wide berth. He carried all he owned in an old feed sack slung over his shoulder, heart pounding with the fear that the strange sunken spot he'd stumbled on during a secret hike 2 summers back might be his last shot at making it through whatever came next. Just 3 days earlier, his grandmother Mae Harlan had laid down the law at the big family Sunday dinner table, her voice sharp and final, like a judge slamming the gavel. "That boy's more trouble than he's worth," she declared. "He wanders off when he ought to be working, buries his nose in books instead of learning something useful. He asks questions no decent kid should ask. I've put food in his mouth for 6 long years since his mama passed, and I'm through. Let him find somewhere else to be a drag." Nobody spoke up for Jasper. His aunts stared hard at their plates like they'd never seen fried chicken before. His uncles cleared their throats and looked away. Even his cousins, the ones he'd once played with and called friends, acted like he'd already disappeared into thin air. In that family, Mae's word was iron law, and kids, especially orphans, were supposed to count their blessings for any scraps of kindness thrown their way. Jasper's only crime was being different, wanting more than the narrow life laid out for him, refusing to shrink down small enough to fit the tiny box they'd built. He'd been Mae's reluctant burden since he was 8, when his mother Ruth Whitaker died of pneumonia in a drafty company shack, while his father Cole Whitaker pulled double shifts in the coal mine that would swallow him up 2 years later. That same mine collapse that took Cole also buried any sense of duty the family felt toward his boy. Their sorrow for the lost son never stretched far enough to cover real care for the orphaned grandson. Mae had taken him in mostly to dodge the gossip. Neighbors would have talked if she'd shipped her own flesh and blood off to the county orphanage. In those tight mountain hollows, where everybody knew everybody else's troubles, keeping up appearances mattered more than showing real love. For 6 hard years, Jasper had paid his way with endless work, up before dawn to help cook and scrub, trudging 3 miles to school, which Mae called a waste for a boy anyway. Then back home to more chores until bone-deep tiredness knocked him out cold. He'd learned quick that thank yous were expected, that any gripe or ask for something extra got slapped down with reminders of how lucky he was to have a roof at all, that he lived there on sufferance, not welcome. What Mae never saw coming was how Jasper turned those long walks to and from school into secret adventures. He'd memorized every ridge and hollow, found spots the grown folks had long forgotten or never knew about. And those books he sneaked time to read? They weren't just stories. They were lifelines. Farming know-how, survival tips, tales of folks who'd carved out lives in the harshest corners through sheer grit and smarts. The hollow Jasper had first found 2 summers earlier sat at the end of an overgrown trail he'd almost missed completely. He'd only spotted the entrance by following the creek uphill to its headwaters, squeezing through a tight crack between sheer rock walls that suddenly opened into something hidden and wild. The hollow itself covered maybe 3 acres, boxed in by towering cliffs on 3 sides that shot up 200 feet, with the only way out to the south where the creek slipped through the gap. But the real wonder wasn't the hollow. It was the sunken pit right in the middle, a perfect circle about 50 feet across and 15 feet deep, ringed by bare rock walls that soaked up the sun's heat like a stone oven and held it tight against the chill. Jasper had slipped back there a dozen times since, watching how the depression stayed noticeably warmer than the woods around it. The rocks gathered warmth all day and gave it back slowly through freezing nights. Plants down in the bottom held their green weeks longer into fall and pushed up weeks earlier in spring than the same kinds just yards away on level ground. He'd read about setups like this in an old library book on ancient farming called Sunken Gardens, that people in cold lands had used for thousands of years to stretch the growing season and raise crops that had no business surviving the winters. The book explained it plain. Cold air sinks and runs downhill like water, collecting in low spots and valleys. But dig a garden into a slope or flat high ground, and you can trap warm air instead, building a pocket microclimate totally different from everything around it. Jasper had lucked into nature's own version of that old trick, a freak geological gift that handed him exactly what ancient farmers had sweated blood to build by hand. On the third day of his grueling trek, Jasper Whitaker finally slipped into the hidden hollow, moving only under cover of night to dodge any prying eyes that might spot him and drag him back to Mae Harlan or the county folks who'd haul him straight to a family that had already written him off. He'd eaten next to nothing, just the handful of cornbread he'd snatched on his way out, and every muscle screamed from nights spent curled in freezing leaf litter, waiting for dark to hide his steps. But the moment he squeezed through the rock gap and caught sight of the sunken garden glowing in the pale dawn light, those stone walls already drinking in the first warm rays, something long buried inside him stirred back to life. Hope, real and fierce, the kind he hadn't felt in 6 long years. He wasn't going to die out here. He wasn't even going to just scrape by. No. He was going to build something right in this forgotten spot that would force every single person who'd tossed him aside to see exactly what they'd lost. The opening weeks hit him like a freight train, pushing his grit to limits he never knew he had, no matter how much he'd read or planned ahead. All he had for tools was the little kitchen knife he'd lifted from Mae's drawer. Food was whatever the early spring woods would grudgingly give up. The inner bark of certain trees his books swore was safe to eat, tender greens poking through in protected nooks, a handful of wild onions whose hiding spots he'd burned into memory from earlier rambles. Weight fell off him he couldn't spare, his skinny kid frame turning sharp and hollow as he burned energy faster than he could take it in. He threw together a rough lean-to against the sunken garden's rock wall, piecing it from branches, strips of bark, and piled leaves, learning the hard way through soaked, shivering nights which setups shed rain, and which ones funneled it straight onto his head while he slept. Yet, in the misery, he started to feel the heartbeat of his new home. He tuned into its quiet patterns, the ones that would one day carry him from bare survival to real thriving. Those rock walls held heat far better than he'd hoped, staying touchably warm hours after sundown and bleeding that stored warmth back into the pit all through the freezing dark. The hollow's south-facing slope and high protective cliffs trapped just enough warmth to let plants grow that had no right thriving at this high Appalachian elevation. He tracked down a tiny spring seeping from the rocks high up at the head of the hollow. Clear water that stayed liquid even when everything else turned to ice. And right then, he started dreaming big. He scratched plans straight into the dirt with a stick, pacing off distances, figuring measurements, picturing a setup that would turn this natural miracle into a year-round food factory. The blueprint taking shape in those first hard weeks pulled straight from every scrap he'd read. Sunken pit greenhouses, earth-bermed growing spaces, the old-time tricks folks used before machines to force crops out of winters that should have killed them. He'd dig the whole depression deeper, widen the floor while building the heat-holding walls taller. He'd carve terraced shelves along the sides so different plants could catch just the right amount of sun and shelter. And he'd cap the top with a roof that let light pour in but locked the warmth tight inside. An enclosed bubble warm enough to keep growing strong even when the thermometer outside plunged below zero. Digging kicked off in late April once the ground softened enough to bite into, and he'd clawed back a little strength from his thin rations. No shovel meant he had to improvise one. He hunted down a flat shard of shale for the blade, bound it tight to a sturdy sapling handle with strips of bark he'd soaked soft then wrapped wet. They'd shrink rock hard as they dried. The thing was rough and slow compared to any real steel spade, But it moved earth, and that was enough. Hour after hour he hacked away, prying loose soil and rock, hauling it out in a willow twig basket he'd woven himself, dumping the spoil along the hollow's edges where it wouldn't slide back in. The pace was brutal, heart-sinking slow. One full day's sweat might shift what a crew with proper gear could do in an hour flat. But Jasper had nothing but time and raw stubbornness, and he learned fast that pure, bull-headed will can move mountains when there's no other road out. By the end of May, he'd stretched the sunken area by a good third, dropped the floor another 4 feet deeper, and pushed the edges out to nearly 60 feet across. The real game-changer hit in early June, right when Jasper Whitaker was pushing his dig deeper into the pit's heart. His makeshift shale shovel slammed through what he'd figured was solid bedrock, and kept going, punching into open air below. Heart hammering, he cleared the loose dirt and stared down into a hidden void he'd never expected. What opened up was an old mine tunnel, one of the countless forgotten shafts riddling these hills from a century of coal digging. This one had been abandoned and lost to memory long before Jasper was even born. The passage ran straight back into the hillside, maybe 40 feet before a cave-in blocked it off. But the tunnel itself stood strong, about 6 feet tall, 8 feet wide, bone-dry, and steady as ever. Pick marks from long-gone miners scarred the walls like old tattoos. In a flash, Jasper knew he'd struck gold. Not ore, but something better. Steady, year-round temperature that his sunken garden could only dream of matching. Down here in these mountains, the earth held fast at around 55 degrees no matter what raged topside. Scorching July afternoons or January blizzards burying everything under snow. That tunnel could double as a perfect root cellar, a frost-proof storage vault, even a spot to coax certain crops through the dead of winter. Paired with the sun-warmed pit above, he suddenly had 2 whole worlds to work with. One solar-heated and alive with light, the other cool, dark, and rock-steady. The range of growing conditions opened up possibilities he'd barely dared imagine. Come midsummer, whispers started drifting through the nearby hollows and hamlets. Somebody was holed up in that god-forsaken spot at the head of Blackberry Creek. Hunters spotted thin curls of campfire smoke drifting up the ridges. A timber crew swore they heard the steady thump of work echoing from high up, where no sane person would settle. The stories were half-baked and all over the map, but they finally landed in the ears of an old-timer named Zeke Boone. He lived by himself in a weathered cabin a few miles off, and the rumors hooked him good. Curiosity was about the only thing left that still got him moving. Zeke had farmed his own patch before the Depression stole it, mined coal until a cave-in smashed his leg and ended that chapter, then drifted through odd jobs the last 10 years. Nobody knew these mountains like he did. 50 years of roaming their edges had mapped every draw and knob in his head. He couldn't wrap his mind around who in their right mind would pick such a brutal, out-of-the-way place to call home. So, on a warm July morning, he set out, hobbling upstream along the creek, his bad leg making every step a fight on the rough ground, but pure, stubborn wonder pulling him forward. It was one of the few sparks still flickering in his lonesome days. He spotted the narrow split between the rock faces, squeezed through, stepped into the hollow, and froze. The place had been reborn. What started as a random dip in the earth was now a deliberate hand-carved pit stretching 60 feet wide and plunging nearly 20 feet deep in the middle. Terraced walls dropped in neat steps toward a floor already showing hard use. Raised beds lined the shelves, packed with rich, dark soil somebody had sweated to build up with compost and rotted leaves. Tender young plants stood in tidy rows, familiar vegetables Zeke knew by heart, plus a few strangers, every one of them thriving in the sheltered warmth of the whole. A rough shelter hugged the north wall, pieced together from scavenged boards and forest scraps, but already growing sturdier with each passing day. And right in the middle of it all stood a skinny kid, dirty shirt, blistered hands, face smudged with earth, looking up from his digging with eyes that burned equal parts fear and fire. "This here's my spot," Jasper said, voice steady even as his pulse raced. "I ain't hurtin' nobody. I ain't taking what ain't mine. I just want to be left be." Zeke took a long, quiet look, clocking the signs of back-breaking days and not enough meals, spotting that raw, hard-won independence that sometimes blooms out of pure desperation. Memories rolled through him, his own wild youth, roads not taken, years spent trying to fit molds that never suited him. He thought of his wife, gone 20 years now, who'd always told him the worst wrong a man could do was stand by when help was needed, and right there for the taking. "I ain't here to stir up trouble," Zeke said at last. "Just heard tell somebody was living way up here, and I couldn't figure who'd be fool enough to try it." He waved a hand at the terraces, the beds, the proof of months of bone-deep labor. "Don't look like you're a fool at all. Looks like you know exactly what you're about." He eased down onto a flat rock, bad leg sighing in relief. "Only thing is, what's your plan when winter rolls in? This setup's something else, but it won't carry you through 3 feet of snow and nights down below zero." Jasper didn't answer right away. The guarded edge in his eyes softened just a fraction, suspicion giving way to careful hope. This wasn't another enemy. This could be the first real ally he'd ever had. "I got plans," he said quietly. "Just need things I can't scrape up myself. Glass for a roof, real tools that don't break, seeds that'll grow in what I can make here." He paused, weighing trust against everything he'd lost already. "I got some food. Not much, but enough to trade." Zeke let out a rough, rusty chuckle, the sound of a man who hadn't laughed much in years. "Kid, you got something worth a sight more than food. You got an idea nobody else in these hills ever dreamed up. Show me what you're fixin' to do with this place, and I'll help you track down whatever you need to pull it off." That moment sealed it. The partnership changed both their lives forever. Zeke Boone brought decades of hard-earned mountain wisdom that Jasper Whitaker still lacked. Know-how in building sturdy structures, coaxing crops from rocky soil, and all those little tricks folks in the hills picked up just to get by when nobody else was coming to help. In return, Jasper carried the kind of bold vision Zeke had long ago buried under years of hard knocks. The rare gift of spotting openings where others only saw dead ends, plus the raw fire and stubborn drive his aging body could no longer muster on its own. Side by side, they labored from the heat of summer straight through the crisp bite of fall, widening and deepening the sunken garden, carving out more of the old tunnel, piecing together the bones of a system that would carry Jasper through his first brutal winter, and, in time, let him flourish in ways neither had dared dream at the start. The glass panes came from a crumbling old church in a played-out coal camp 15 miles down the road. The windows were still good, despite sitting exposed to rain and wind for years. Zeke had known the preacher who once ran the place, knew the building had been left to rot rather than officially shut down, knew nobody would kick up a fuss if a few panes found fresh use. They borrowed a sure-footed mule and made 3 slow, careful hauls, each round trip eating 2 full days, every fragile sheet wrapped thick in straw and eased over roots and rocks that could smash it in a heartbeat. The tools Zeke handed over freely from his own battered collection, hoes, spades, and saws he'd gathered over a lifetime, but no longer had the strength to swing hard. Now they went to hands that would actually make them sing. The seeds arrived through Zeke's old network, fellow gardeners and farmers he'd swapped with over the wandering years, passing down tough, mountain-hardy heirlooms that families had guarded like treasure because variety was the best shield against lean years and bad luck. October saw the roof take shape. A sturdy timber frame patched together and topped with those mismatched church windows, slanted sharp to grab every low winter sun ray, while letting snow slide off instead of piling up and blocking the light. It wasn't pretty. The jumble of different sizes and shapes would have made any proper carpenter wince. But it worked like a charm. Sun poured through the glass, slammed into the rock walls and dark soil beds below, heating them deep. That warmth rose and got caught under the glass lid, locked in tight so it couldn't leak back out into the freezing air above. Jasper had also dug a narrow connecting passage through the rock to link the tunnel directly to the pit, giving the whole setup even steadier temps, a constant 55 degrees down below, no matter how wild things got outside. By November, when the first real freezes rolled in, Jasper had a working underground greenhouse unlike anything else in Appalachian West Virginia. Most farm experts would have laughed and called it impossible if you'd asked them on paper. That first winter put Jasper through the ringer, but he came out stronger than even he expected. The greenhouse held steady above 40 degrees on most bitter nights, dipping only to the mid-30s during the worst cold fronts when the thermometer outside cratered way below zero. The winter crops he'd picked took off in that protected bubble. Tough greens like kale and spinach, plus exotic Asian varieties Zeke had scored through a contact down in Charleston. Root crops tucked away in the tunnel at ideal temp. Fragrant herbs that added taste and healing to the table. By February, Jasper had food piling up faster than he could eat it. Zeke started quietly bartering the surplus in nearby hollows, always claiming it came from his own patch, because word of a lone 13-year-old kid scratching out a living in the high country would have brought the wrong kind of eyes right to the door. Still, the vegetables' crisp freshness, in a season when most folks scraped by on jarred beans and cellar potatoes, sparked questions Zeke dodged with vague answers. He shielded Jasper's secret while quietly building a name for produce folks started craving more of every week. Spring pushed things bigger, summer sharpened the edges, and by the second winter the setup had grown so much that Zeke's made-up garden story couldn't cover the sheer volume and variety anymore. Jasper made the call to come clean, after turning the risks and rewards over in his mind for weeks, then laying out every careful step the way he always did. He picked 3 women from the closest settlements and asked them up to the hollow. Zeke helped choose. Kind souls who'd helped without strings, women known for keeping their word and holding secrets close, the kind who might truly get what he'd built and why he'd kept it hidden so long. They showed up figuring they'd see a big patch of ground, maybe some lucky sunny spot. What they saw stopped them cold for what felt like forever, standing frozen at the rim of the sunken greenhouse, eyes wide, taking in the stepped terraces lined with thriving beds, the patchwork glass roof catching the pale winter light, and the impossible bounty growing strong in a season and place where nothing should have been green at all. Jasper walked them through every inch, breaking down how the whole thing worked with quiet, patient detail, like a kid who'd spent endless nights thinking through each piece. He showed them the underground tunnel where roots and tubers stayed crisp and perfect, the cozy seed-starting nook where he'd get plants going weeks before the last frost, the clever dance of stored heat in the rocks and captured sunlight that kept everything warm without burning a single drop of fuel. By the time the tour wrapped, Lila, Faye, and Bess weren't just stunned. They were lit up with real excitement, seeing straight through to what this could mean way beyond one boy's fight to stay alive. These mountain hollows battled hunger every winter, families scraping by on jars of put-up beans, salt pork, and whatever roots lasted in the cellar. Kids grew pale and sickly without fresh greens through the long, cold months. Jasper had cracked that problem wide open. He'd built a blueprint anyone with grit and a shovel could copy, a way to rewrite how folks in these hills put food on the table. Word raced through the 3 closest villages faster than wildfire on Dry Ridge. Real hope, the kind that had become scarce in places used to settling for less. Folks started showing up, arms crossed and doubtful at first, only to walk away changed. Believers in something that felt downright obvious once you saw it, but nobody had ever bothered to try before. Jasper held nothing back. He taught open-handed, sharing every lesson hard-won from trial and error, helping people scout spots for their own setups, tweaking plans to match whatever ground and scraps they had on hand. In the 3 years that followed, 11 more underground greenhouses rose across the nearby ridges, each one fitted to its own patch of mountain, but every last one built on the same core ideas Jasper had hammered out through sweat and watching. The difference showed up quick and clear. Families who hadn't tasted fresh anything from November to April now pulled greens and roots straight from their pits all winter long. Kids got stronger, sickness eased off, doctor bills shrank. Cash started flowing, too. Extra harvests hauled to bigger towns and sold for real money in places that had leaned hard on barter and barely getting by for generations. Mae Harlan caught wind of the greenhouses, heard talk of the boy who'd dreamed them up, heard his name spoken with quiet respect and real thanks. She never once made the trip to see it, never gave a nod to what her cast-off grandson had pulled off, never breathed a word that maybe she'd been wrong about him. She passed in the winter of 1962, 8 years after she'd run him out, still telling anyone who'd listened that the kid had always been pure trouble. Jasper showed up for the funeral, slipping in late and standing way at the back of the little church. He left before anybody could catch his eye or say a word. No tears came, no sharp grief he could name. Just a quiet ache for something that had never had the chance to grow. For the grandmother he might have loved if she'd ever let love in, or given any back. Zeke Boone slipped away peaceful in his sleep come spring of 1965, right there in the same cabin where he'd lived solitary for decades. His last years had been the brightest since losing his wife, finding fresh purpose in Jasper's work, real joy watching the scared runaway kid turn into a sure-footed young man who knew his own strength. In his will, he left the cabin and the land to Jasper, the first thing he'd ever truly owned. A gift that sealed the bond they'd built when bloodkin had turned their backs. At 22, Jasper married Nora Hale, the young woman who'd rolled up her sleeves to help raise one of the community greenhouses, and saw him as a true equal, not something to own or boss around. They made their home together in the hollow, stretching the original greenhouse bigger, adding snug living space, raising 3 kids who grew up knowing full well that plenty on the table wasn't a given, and that folks with enough backbone could make the so-called impossible happen. The greenhouse network kept spreading, not because Jasper chased bigger, but because neighbors kept showing up asking how, begging to learn, hungry for the change he'd shown was possible. By 1980, when Jasper Whitaker hit 40, more than 40 underground greenhouses were up and running across the Appalachian hills. Every single one of them drew its core ideas straight back to that original sunken pit. A desperate 13-year-old boy had widened with nothing but a homemade shale scraper because survival left him no other road. Agricultural scientists finally caught on and put his methods on paper, turning out papers and reports that carried his discoveries to folks way outside these ridges. They dressed it all up in fancy scientific words: thermal mass, passive solar gain, microclimate engineering, to explain what Jasper had figured out just by watching, digging, and paying attention. The studies gave his work the stamp of approval the college crowd respected, but they didn't add a single new truth to what he already knew in his bones. Jasper Whitaker stayed put in his hollow right up to the end, passing in 2019 at 79 after 65 years in the very spot his grandmother's cold shoulder had driven him to claim. His kids and grandkids still tend the first greenhouse, still pass on the know-how he pieced together, still keep food coming to families who would otherwise face empty plates through the long, hard mountain winters. The sunken garden he first broke open with that crude stone blade has grown bigger and better over more than 6 decades, but the heart of it hasn't changed one bit. Still soaking up sun, storing it in the rocks and soil, still holding steady warmth through the meanest freezes with zero outside fuel. The old mine tunnel he stumbled into by pure chance now stretches back over 200 feet into the hill, offering ideal, frost-free storage for tons of produce that keeps not just his own kin fed, but whole neighborhoods that now count on the security he built from scratch. Those 3 little villages his greenhouses first helped have turned into solid, lively places. Folks sticking around, numbers holding steady, while so many other Appalachian towns have faded away. Their economies got a real lift from the steady food production Jasper's ideas made possible. The real heart of Jasper Whitaker's story goes way past greenhouses, digging techniques, or any one trick you could copy somewhere else. It's about what people are capable of when life knocks them down hard, turning outright rejection into rocket fuel for building instead of breaking. Mae Harlan threw him out because he didn't fit, because he asked too many questions, because he dreamed bigger than the tight little life mountain ways expected of boys. Those exact same traits that got him shut out of her house were the ones that let him create something her narrow mind could never picture. The curiosity folks labeled a nuisance turned into the spark of real invention. The wandering they called lazy became the scouting that uncovered the hidden hollow. The book reading they dismissed as pointless became the wisdom that turned a random rock formation into a year-round lifeline of fresh food. Every single thing Mae Harlan had picked apart and condemned ended up being the exact ingredients of his triumph. Every so-called flaw flipped into a superpower the moment it landed in a place that let it breathe. So here's the question staring right back at you. What parts of yourself have you been told are broken, wrong, things to fix or hide because they make you less acceptable? What could those same pieces turn into if you ever found, or fought for, a spot where they could run free? Where being different stopped being a liability and started being your edge? And what incredible thing might you build if you quit squeezing yourself small to squeeze into boxes made by people too blind to see what you could really do? Jasper Whitaker got tossed aside by the only family he had because he flat out refused to shrink down small enough for their comfort. He found a lonely hollow in the mountains and raised up something nobody in his old life could have dreamed. Something that fed whole communities, changed lives for the better, and proved the very qualities they'd scorned were precisely what the world needed to fix problems nobody else even saw. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.